So we're going to look at the portrait of evil in The Lord of the Rings. And a little bit more theological and technical, at least at the front end, than normally, because I think it's important to understand Tolkien's work properly, and also to observe what I said last time about the way in which his language gives rise to his myths and further to his thought in general. So I talked about the way in which modern ways of using language have an idea and make the words conform to that idea. An illustration of that is in gender identity, for instance. So you come up with a word that will identify the idea that you have yourself. That's just one example, but it's all over the place. It's certain views of language, which I talk about in my contemporary lit theory course. And what you get then is a view of language which in the medieval university period is called the view called realism, as opposed to that of nominalism. Nominalism is that the words don't actually lay hold of a reality that is there, but they're just words that refer to our understanding of them without actually partaking of that in any way. And these are not small matters. The university in its medieval origins, that debate is right there, right at the beginning, and I'm not sure it ever goes away. And to some degree it carries on in the academy to this day. Probably not surprisingly, since in universities we teach and use language under the auspices of knowledge, science, and so forth. And as we've seen in Tolkien's work so far, but also in Lewis's, we spent more time on that. That's at the heart of what he's talking about in That Hideous Strength. The modern Tower of Babel is predicated on the idea that we are at the top of the evolutionary ladder and can name a reality in accordance with our will, and then it comes into being. And pulling back a little bit, I said at the outset of the course, talking about Descartes and his mind-body dualism, if you recall. I realize I'm a little bit obscure at the beginning, but it's just necessary for background. The res cogitans, remember he used the method of doubt because he couldn't trust his senses, because astronomy had been overthrown by numerous discoveries in astronomy. So he proposed a method of doubt in around 1640 and established certainty on the basis of doubt. This is not inconsequential. I think it's actually entirely central to what happens thereafter. In the medieval Renaissance period, just like in the ancient world, although there's disagreements, the mainstream of thought is that there is this thing called rationality which humans possess, and God in himself is entirely reasonable. That's not a description, a psychological description of his character. He is the essence of reason. He is the logos. And that's living in reality, is acknowledging with our capacity for reason, because remember, Boethius says that to be a human being or a person is to be an individual substance of a rational nature. It's an individual of a rational nature, just like Jesus is the logos of God, and the universe bespeaks to a comprehensible, rational universe that also declares that its creator has left his design on the universe. So if you look at Psalm 19, it talks about the heavens declaring the glory of God. So that's the book of nature, and it bespeaks a rational origin. And the book of grace likewise supplements that with something that's not contradictory to it, but we'd be oblivious to were it not for revelation, divine revelation, as in the book of grace. Namely, that God is gracious, compassionate, merciful in his nature, and will atone for sin, human sin, etc. Which, looking at the book of nature, we see no signs of that. There's no sign of atonement in the world per se, although there are some in the old myths. The idea of Dionysus dying, being torn apart and being raised again, that various mythologies point to that sort of story. But it's not really there reading off the face of the created order itself. We don't see resurrection unless you see it in the cycle of the seasons, spring. But then it happens again, so it doesn't really seem to be very meaningful. But that idea of a use of reason based on doubt has the problem of connecting to the world around it with the bodily, physical order. And so Descartes, in his view of human nature, people call the view of Descartes the ghost in the machine, is that the body is just an extension of thought. He calls it res extensa. So the thinking substance, which he says he is in his essence, the res cogitans, is who he is. He can't doubt that he's doubting. If he doubts, he exists. If he exists, he can imagine a greater existence than his, namely God's, etc. But it's all predicated on doubt and thinking. He has a trouble connecting anything outside of himself. And so he will use reason instrumentally. This is a key point. He uses it instrumentally. He uses it to gain power over nature. He doesn't ask the purpose of reason. He doesn't ask if reason is connected with God's purposes and designs, whether there's an intent to reason or an end of reasoning. It doesn't refer to the book of Revelation at all, by which I mean the Bible. It doesn't refer to that, just from the vantage point of thinking. And so that use of reasoning and gaining power over nature through technology is at the heart of what we saw in Lewis's fiction, and it is also at the heart of what Tolkien will talk about. The Ring of Power is, among other things, a symbol of technology. It's a certain type of power that gains power over all flesh. That's how he describes it, even in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien. And that's why they long for it. It's a symbol of a certain approach to the world, which we will call evil. Right? Because it's domination. Sauron is clearly an evil being. And recognizably so, and part of the power of The Lord of the Rings is exactly that we recognize that at play here are forces of good and forces of evil in a sort of cosmic titanic struggle, right? I don't think there's any dispute over that, and that's one of the reasons why it's so compelling. People like and are drawn to those sorts of stories, always have been. And this one is really pointed around that. Even though, we said this last time, there's no God in it. There's no religious, there's no churches, there's no religious activities per se, there's no prayer. And yet, good and evil are at work in it. So I wanted to come to that. How is evil actually portrayed in The Lord of the Rings? We'll talk about good, but I want to focus on the evil in particular. You have a question before I do that, please?
Even as it pertains to what Tolkien is doing with evil, why do you think it's easier for evil to be conceptualized versus good? Like, good seems to be almost mysterious, whereas evil is concrete. Like, there's bad, there's destruction, but then when you try to then depict good, it becomes more...
Why? Because the devil has a hold on your mind, that's why. I don't mean you. I mean our minds. Evil hits you in the face. Right. The problem of pain is that you can't ignore it. It's a reality that seems so hard that you can't deny it, right? And so that's the real problem, and that's the problem of evil. And one of the issues that is dealt with in the topic of philosophy called theodicy, which is the defense of God's goodness, which I'm talking about in my other class on Milton. He writes to justify the ways of gods to men, gods of God to men, which is a form of, that's what theodicy does. before the term actually exists, because it's Leibniz in the 18th century that uses the word theodicy for the first time. But the topic exists before that. He pushes it in a different direction. I don't think I'm going to get there today, although I might. It's not my intent to get into the issue of theodicy. Our dean, Professor Franks, wrote a book on that topic of evil, which I'll refer you to. Interesting. But why does evil seem more real than good? Because we take good for granted, is the simple answer, and don't recognize the extraordinary strength of goodness and the extraordinary power of beauty and the power of truth, because that which is what Scripture itself declares, and the power of logic to destroy strongholds and subvert lies and destroy the works of the devil. Hence, Christianity has always been connected with the life of the mind. It's not just good living, it's right thinking. And so it's connected to the truth, because there's the ground of solidity, there's the ground on which we are together with God. But evil, we have the problem of evil. And furthermore, to your point, how is it that it appears more evil? We'll make even a stronger case. After Auschwitz, how is it not that we see evil as even more substantial than good? Because it seems like there's not a lot of goodness, and it does seem like there's a great deal of evil, particularly in that event. Remember, he's writing The Lord of the Rings, doesn't publish it till afterwards, but during the build-up to the Second World War and during it. And most people would connect the Nazi regime with great evil, right? So how does he deal with this issue of evil, and how does he portray it, and how does he not portray it? So there's two things that can be said about it. The sense of evil in The Lord of the Rings is